Before the sun set, the Alpha King would lose his crown, his name, and every memory he had ever carried. Ethan Blackwood never enjoyed hunting because of the chase. He hunted because the northern villages slept more peacefully when dangerous predators stayed deep in the mountains instead of wandering toward lonely farms. Frostpine Mountain greeted the new day beneath a pale winter sky, its towering pines wrapped in fresh snow while icy wind whispered through the cliffs. Ethan rode at the front without a royal banner or polished armor, dressed in a dark hunting coat like any experienced woodsman. Behind him, Lucas Hayes struggled to hide a yawn. Remind me why dangerous animals always wake up before sunrise. Mason Carter never looked away from the trail ahead. Because they know you'll still be asleep. Lucas sighed dramatically. One day I'm going to get a compliment from you. Ethan smiled without turning around. Don't rush miracles. Lucas laughed. See? That's why I follow him. Mason answered calmly. You follow him because he's usually right. Ethan slowed his horse as a snowshoe hare darted across the trail and disappeared beneath a fallen pine. Lucas instinctively reached toward the bough hanging from his saddle before Ethan quietly raised one hand. Lucas immediately lowered it without a word. Let it go, Ethan said. It's only trying to survive another winter. Lucas watched the tiny animal vanish into the forest. You've always had a soft spot for the little ones. Ethan shrugged lightly. Not every hunt needs a prize. The trail narrowed as the three riders climbed higher. Beneath them stretched hundreds of acres of untouched forest, glowing beneath the early morning sun. Usually the mountains welcomed them with birdsong and distant waterfalls, but today something felt different. Ethan noticed it before he understood it. His wolf grew unusually alert, listening to a silence that didn't belong here. The horses became restless. Their ears flicked toward the trees while their breathing turned uneasy. Mason felt it next. Your Majesty. Ethan had already dismounted. He crouched beside a set of enormous tracks pressed deep into the snow. Fresh, sharp-edged, far too large for any ordinary mountain bear. Lucas stepped closer and whistled softly. I've never seen prints like those. Ethan rested one gloved hand against the frozen ground. The snow beneath his fingertips was still loose, disturbed only minutes earlier. Whatever had passed through here was close. Very close. High above them, a flock of ravens suddenly burst into the sky as though fleeing from something hidden beneath the trees. A loose stone cracked free from the cliff overhead and tumbled into the valley below. Ethan slowly rose, his silver eyes fixed on the dark forest ahead. He didn't need fear to tell him danger was waiting. His wolf had already recognized it. Without looking back, he spoke only 4 quiet words. Stay close. Stay ready. Then a roar rolled through the mountains so deep it seemed to shake the frozen earth itself. The roar echoed a second time, closer now, vibrating through the frozen ground beneath Ethan's boots. Lucas instinctively tightened his grip on his bow, while Mason's hand rested on the hilt of his sword without drawing it. Ethan didn't either. His wolf had already made the decision his mind was still catching up to. This was not the sound of a predator searching for food. It was a warning. Ethan lifted one hand without looking back. The silent signal was enough. Lucas immediately stepped to the left, while Mason moved to the right, giving their king a clear path through the trees. Years of fighting beside Ethan had taught them that when his instincts spoke, hesitation could become the greatest danger. They advanced slowly beneath towering pines whose branches sagged beneath fresh snow. Every few steps Ethan paused, studying the forest instead of rushing forward. Broken branches lay scattered across the ground. Fresh claw marks scored the trunks of ancient trees several feet above his head. Whatever had passed through here possessed tremendous strength, yet the forest showed no signs of panic beyond this narrow trail. Ethan frowned. His wolf sensed something else. The silence itself felt wrong. Lucas crouched beside another massive footprint pressed deep into the snow. It has to be the same bear the shepherds reported. Ethan knelt beside him and brushed away loose snow with the back of his glove. The edges remained sharp. Less than an hour old, he said quietly. Mason looked toward the steep cliffs above them. If it wanted us, it could have attacked already. Ethan slowly stood, his silver eyes following the winding path climbing toward the ridge. It does not want us. Lucas blinked. Then why keep roaring? Ethan answered without taking his eyes off the mountain. Because it wants us to stay away from whatever is behind it. None of them spoke after that. High above, A flock of ravens burst from the trees all at once, their dark wings scattering across the pale winter sky. Even the horses tethered farther down the trail snorted nervously. Ethan felt the mountain changing around them. The wind grew stronger. Snow drifted across the narrow path. Somewhere beyond the ridge, small stones clicked against one another as though the cliffs themselves had begun to shift. They climbed another 100 yards until the trees suddenly opened onto a broad shelf of weathered rock overlooking a valley hidden beneath rolling clouds. Then they saw it. The mountain bear stood on the opposite ridge, backlit by the morning sun. It was magnificent rather than monstrous, its thick winter coat glowing like bronze beneath the golden light. It did not charge. It simply watched them with calm, intelligent eyes, standing between the hunters and whatever lay beyond the ridge. Lucas exhaled slowly. It is even bigger than the stories. Mason spoke just above a whisper. It is not hunting us. Ethan nodded once. No. His wolf understood now. The bear was guarding its territory, just as he would protect his own kingdom. He slowly removed his heavy cloak and handed it to Lucas. Take the horses farther back. Lucas hesitated. And you? Ethan's expression never changed. I will see if there is another way through. Before either guard could answer, the great bear turned and disappeared over the ridge. Ethan stepped onto the narrow mountain path leading after it. The first stone beneath his boot shifted ever so slightly. He stopped. Behind him, Lucas looked up sharply. Your Majesty. The freezing rush of water reached him before the memories did. Ethan's eyes opened to a sky washed in pale afternoon light, where white clouds drifted lazily above swaying treetops. For several long seconds he did not move. Every breath carried the sharp scent of fresh water, damp earth, and moss. His head throbbed with a dull ache that seemed to pulse with every heartbeat. He slowly pushed himself upright, wincing as cold river water slipped from his clothes. Pebbles shifted beneath his hands. The current flowed quietly beside him as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Ethan frowned. Something had happened. He knew that much. He searched his mind for a name, a place, a face, but every thought disappeared into a wall of empty silence. Who was he? Why was he lying beside an unfamiliar river? The harder he tried to remember, the sharper the pain became until he instinctively closed his eyes. He released a slow breath and let the questions drift away. His body reacted before his thoughts did. He stood, testing his balance. Every muscle ached, yet he remained surprisingly steady on his feet. Somewhere beyond the trees came the faint splash of a fish breaking the surface. Farther away, a squirrel scrambled across rough bark. Without understanding why, Ethan knew exactly where each sound had come from. His wolf still remembered what his mind had forgotten. He knelt beside the river and caught his reflection in the clear water. A stranger stared back at him. Silver eyes, dark hair damp against his forehead. A small scrape marked his temple, but nothing explained the emptiness inside his mind. He reached into the pockets of his coat, hoping to find something that belonged to him. They were empty. Not a coin, not a letter, not even a single clue. A faint chirping drew his attention toward a nearby bush. A tiny songbird fluttered helplessly, one delicate wing tangled beneath a cluster of thorny vines. Ethan hesitated only a moment before carefully kneeling beside it. His fingers worked slowly, freeing the frightened bird without causing it harm. The little creature remained in his palm for a heartbeat, its tiny chest rising and falling rapidly, before lifting into the air and disappearing through the trees. Ethan watched it go with a quiet smile that surprised even himself. Somehow, helping the bird had felt natural. It was the first thing all day that had felt certain. The afternoon sun drifted lower as he began following the river downstream. He did not know where it would lead, only that moving forward felt safer than standing still. Every now and then his wolf urged him toward fresh water, away from unstable ground, around fallen trees hidden beneath thick grass. He trusted those instincts because they were all he had left. Hours passed. The ache in his stomach slowly grew into a deep, relentless hunger unlike anything he had ever experienced. At first, Ethan ignored it, believing it was simply the price of wandering through the wilderness without food. But with every mile, the hunger grew heavier until it became something deeper than pain. His steps slowed. He reached out to steady himself against the rough trunk of an old pine, just as a sharp ache spread through his chest. Another followed. Then another. His breathing became uneven as every muscle in his body tightened. It felt as though something ancient had awakened deep inside him, answering a call his forgotten mind could no longer understand. Ethan dropped to one knee, fighting to stay conscious. A low growl escaped his throat before he even realized the sound belonged to him. Brilliant silver light shimmered briefly beneath his skin. His body trembled as instinct quietly overcame reason. Thick white fur spread across his body while the world around him seemed to sharpen all at once. The whisper of distant leaves, the rush of the river, the heartbeat of frightened birds hidden among the branches. When the pain finally faded, the man who had awakened beside the river was gone. A magnificent white wolf stood silently beneath the towering pines, breathing heavily as the cool evening breeze stirred his thick winter coat. Confusion still lingered somewhere deep inside him, but it no longer mattered. Hunger remained. Survival remained. The great white wolf began moving silently through the forest. The scent drifted through the evening air so gently that Ethan almost believed he had imagined it. He stood perfectly still, letting the breeze brush across his face once more. There it was again. Warm grain, dry hay, fresh eggs, and something rich that made the emptiness in his stomach tighten until he quietly pressed a hand against it. Hunger no longer felt like a simple discomfort. It felt like an invisible hand pulling him forward. His feet began moving before he consciously decided to follow. The narrow animal trail wound through the trees until the forest slowly opened into a peaceful clearing. A small wooden cabin rested beside a vegetable garden surrounded by a weathered split-rail fence. Smoke curled lazily from the stone chimney, carrying the comforting scent of burning oak. Wildflowers swayed beside a narrow porch where a rocking chair sat quietly in the fading light. Ethan stopped beneath the cover of the trees, watching the cottage without understanding why it felt strangely familiar. Not the place itself, but the feeling. Warmth. Safety. Home. The thought disappeared as quickly as it arrived. Then another scent reached him, stronger than the smoke from the chimney. Chickens. His wolf recognized it instantly. He slowly turned his head toward a sturdy wooden coop standing behind the cabin. Through the small gaps between the boards came soft clucking, the gentle rustle of feathers, and the unmistakable smell of well-fed hens settling in for the night. Ethan swallowed. His stomach answered with another painful growl. He looked toward the cabin again. A soft golden light glowed behind the window curtains. Someone lived here. Someone kind enough to keep the garden neat and the animals well cared for. He did not want to frighten anyone. He took one step backward, intending to leave. His stomach tightened again so fiercely that he nearly lost his balance. The scent drifting from the chicken coop overwhelmed every other thought. His wolf did not understand ownership or fences. It understood only survival. Almost without realizing it, Ethan slipped quietly across the yard, careful enough that even the dry grass barely whispered beneath his boots. He reached the little gate of the coop and gently pushed it open just wide enough to look inside. At least a dozen plump hens rested peacefully on their wooden roosts. One fluffy white hen made a tiny snoring sound that would have been almost funny under different circumstances. Ethan blinked in surprise. Even through his hunger, the sleepy little noise nearly drew a smile from him. He slowly reached one cautious hand forward, hoping he could catch a single bird quickly without causing panic. Before his fingers came close, one curious brown hen opened a single eye and stared directly at him. For one perfectly silent heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then the hen threw back its head and released the loudest cluck Ethan had ever heard. Instantly, every chicken in the coop exploded into frantic flapping wings, bouncing feathers, and indignant squawking. One particularly determined hen fluttered straight toward Ethan's face, forcing him to stumble backward in complete surprise. Another landed on the roof of the coop, announcing the emergency to the entire valley with relentless enthusiasm. Ethan instinctively raised both hands as though apologizing to the outraged flock. The noise grew louder with every passing second. Inside the quiet cabin, a warm light suddenly shifted behind the curtains. Someone had awakened. The cabin door opened with a soft creak, spilling warm golden light across the quiet yard. Grace Miller stepped onto the porch holding an oil lantern in one hand and an old wooden broom in the other. She had been halfway through mending a quilt before the frantic chorus outside shattered the peaceful evening. "Ruby," she called with a sleepy sigh. "What have you started now?" The hens answered with even louder clucking. One particularly dramatic white hen stood proudly on the roof of the coop, flapping her wings as though announcing the arrival of a royal parade. Grace shook her head with a tired smile. "You make more noise than a thunderstorm." She crossed the yard carefully, the lantern casting gentle circles of light over the grass. At first she expected to find a fox nosing around the fence, or perhaps a curious raccoon searching for an easy meal. Instead, she stopped so suddenly that the lantern swayed in her hand. A massive white wolf stood beside the open coop door. Moonlight brushed across thick silver-white fur that should have looked powerful, yet all Grace could see were exhaustion and hunger. The wolf did not bare its teeth. It did not growl. Its breathing was slow and uneven, and its head remained lowered as though even standing required effort. For several quiet seconds, neither of them moved. Ethan watched the young woman without understanding why his wolf refused to see her as a threat. The warm scent of fresh bread, lavender, and clean linen surrounded her, carrying a strange sense of comfort that settled the restless instincts inside him. Grace studied him just as carefully. His coat was soaked from the river. His paws were scratched from miles of rough ground. Even from several yards away, she could see how thin he looked beneath the thick winter fur. Then she noticed something else. The coop door had been left open, feathers floated through the air, and yet every chicken was still alive. The wolf could have taken one easily. Instead, it simply stood there looking almost embarrassed while the hens continued scolding him without mercy. Ruby puffed out her feathers and let out another loud cluck directly above his head. Ethan blinked in surprise and instinctively leaned away from the noisy little bird. Grace covered her mouth, trying very hard not to laugh. "You lost an argument with a chicken?" she whispered. The wolf lowered his eyes for a brief moment, making him look less like a fierce predator and more like someone who had made a very unfortunate mistake. Grace slowly rested the broom against the fence. "Do not move," she said softly. "I will be right back." Ethan remained exactly where he was. Every instinct urged him to follow the scent of food, yet something about the gentle confidence in her voice made him wait. A moment later, Grace returned carrying a wooden bowl with leftover roasted chicken and a small loaf of bread. She hesitated for only an instant before placing the food on the ground several feet away. Then she quietly stepped back. "You must be starving," she said. Ethan waited until she had moved a safe distance before approaching. He lowered his head cautiously and began eating with surprising restraint, never once looking away from the young woman watching him beneath the lantern's warm glow. When the last bite was gone, he lifted his head as though preparing to disappear back into the forest. He managed only a single step before his legs suddenly gave way beneath him. The world tilted. Exhaustion swallowed what little strength remained, and he collapsed gently onto the cool grass. Grace's eyes widened in alarm as she hurried toward the motionless wolf. Grace set the lantern on the ground and hurried to the great white wolf's side. For one anxious heartbeat, she simply watched his chest rise and fall, relieved to see that he was still breathing. His eyes remained closed, and the exhaustion written across his face looked deeper than anything she had ever seen in a wild animal. She knelt carefully, keeping one hand where he could see it if he woke unexpectedly. "You picked a terrible place to take a nap," she murmured gently. Ruby answered from the roof of the chicken coop with another loud cluck that sounded suspiciously like an opinion. Grace looked up and smiled. "Yes, Ruby, I noticed." The outspoken hen fluffed her feathers proudly before settling back onto the roof as if she had successfully defended the entire farm by herself. Grace shook her head with quiet amusement before returning her attention to the wolf. His thick winter coat was still damp from the river, and the evening air was growing colder by the minute. "I cannot leave you out here," she whispered. She glanced toward the cabin, then toward the crowded little chicken coop. The cabin was too small, and inviting an unfamiliar wolf inside would not only be risky, but unfair to the animals she cared for every day. Her eyes settled on the coop once more. "You girls are not going to like this," she said softly. Several hens immediately answered with suspicious clucking, almost as though they understood every word. Grace laughed under her breath. "It is only for tonight." She disappeared into the shed beside the garden and returned with an armful of fresh straw and an old wool blanket that had belonged to her father. She spread the straw across one empty corner of the coop, creating a thick, dry bed before carefully folding the blanket over the top. Ruby watched every movement with obvious concern, pacing back and forth along her favorite perch. "Do not worry," Grace assured her. "He already proved he is much kinder than he looks." With patient determination, she gently encouraged the exhausted wolf toward the little shelter. Ethan stirred slightly as her calm voice reached him. He could barely keep his eyes open, yet somehow the quiet warmth in her words felt safer than the dark forest beyond the fence. His legs trembled as he slowly struggled to his feet. Grace stepped backward instead of pulling him, allowing him to choose each careful step on his own. He followed without understanding why. One by one, the hens shuffled farther along their roosts to make room, grumbling dramatically the entire time. Ruby remained closest, tilting her head from one side to the other as though inspecting the unusual guest. Ethan lowered himself onto the fresh straw with a slow, weary sigh. The soft bedding felt warmer than the cold ground beside the river, and for the first time since waking without his memories, the tight knot inside his chest eased ever so slightly. Grace placed a small bowl of clean water beside him before lightly touching the edge of the blanket. "There," she said with a gentle smile. "That should help you stay warm." Ethan lifted his head just enough to meet her eyes. Neither of them spoke. They did not need to. Something quiet and unfamiliar passed between them. Not trust yet, but the first fragile step toward it. Grace lowered the lantern flame, closed the coop door without locking it, and looked back one last time. "Good night," she whispered. As the yard grew silent beneath the stars, Ruby hopped down from her perch, took 3 careful steps across the straw, and curled up against the great white wolf's thick fur. Ethan never opened his eyes, but the smallest hint of peace softened his expression as sleep finally claimed him. Morning sunlight slipped gently through the wooden slats of the chicken coop, painting warm golden stripes across the fresh straw. Outside, birds greeted the new day while a cool breeze carried the sweet scent of wildflowers through the little farm. Ethan slowly opened his eyes. For a quiet moment, he simply listened. The river murmured somewhere beyond the trees. Chickens clucked softly around him. Nothing felt threatening. Nothing demanded that he run. It was the first peaceful morning he could remember, although he could not remember anything before it. Ruby was already awake. The proud white hen stood only a few feet away, staring at her unusual guest with unmistakable determination. She took 3 tiny steps forward, stretched out her neck, and pecked gently against Ethan's front paw. Ethan blinked in surprise and lifted his paw away. Ruby immediately pecked the empty patch of straw again, apparently satisfied that she had completed her morning inspection. Grace opened the coop door just in time to witness the entire exchange. She laughed softly. "Ruby approves of almost nobody," she said. "Congratulations. You survived your first inspection." Ruby answered with a single confident cluck before marching away as though she owned the entire farm. Ethan watched the little hen disappear between the other chickens, and for the first time since waking beside the river, the corner of his mouth lifted into the faintest hint of a smile. Grace carried in a fresh bowl of water and another simple breakfast. She placed both beside him before stepping back, giving him the same respectful distance she had offered the night before. "Good morning," she said gently. "You look much better today." Ethan quietly ate while she opened the coop so the hens could wander into the yard. One by one they hurried outside, scratching happily through the grass as sunlight warmed their feathers. Ruby paused beside Ethan once more, tilted her head thoughtfully, then marched away without another complaint. Grace smiled. That is practically friendship coming from her. After finishing the meal, Ethan slowly stood. His strength had begun to return, though his body still felt heavier than it should. Grace unlatched the wide gate leading toward the open fields and stepped aside. "You are free to go whenever you want," she said. "I will not stop you." Ethan looked toward the forest. Tall pines swayed beyond the fence, inviting him back into the endless wilderness where no questions waited for him. He remained completely still. The forest promised survival. The little farm offered something he could not explain. Safety. Grace simply nodded as though she understood his silence. Without asking anything more, she picked up 2 wooden buckets and walked toward the vegetable garden. Ethan watched her kneel beside neat rows of carrots, beans, and cabbage, carefully pulling weeds before watering each row with patient hands. She hummed a quiet melody that drifted across the morning air, simple and comforting. After several moments, Ethan stepped out of the coop and wandered across the yard, not toward the forest but toward the shade of an old maple tree overlooking the garden. He settled there silently, watching Grace work while birds fluttered from fence post to fence post above them. Time passed without either of them speaking. There was no awkwardness in the silence. It simply existed, calm and steady like the nearby river. Grace eventually lifted one of the heavy water buckets and started toward the garden path. Halfway there, the worn wooden handle suddenly cracked. The bucket slipped from her hand, tilting toward the ground as water splashed across the grass. Before she could react, a large white shape moved with astonishing speed across the yard. Before the wooden bucket could strike the ground, Ethan lunged forward with effortless speed. His shoulder caught the handle just as it slipped from Grace's fingers, and the bucket settled safely against the grass with only a few drops of water splashing onto the garden path. Grace stared for a heartbeat before letting out a relieved laugh. "Thank you," she said warmly. Ethan tilted his head, uncertain whether he fully understood the words, but her smile required no explanation. It was brighter than the morning sunlight spilling across the little farm. Grace picked up the bucket again and noticed the cracked wooden handle hanging loosely from one side. "Well," she sighed, "I suppose that bucket finally decided it had worked hard enough." Ruby wandered over at once, inspecting the broken handle with exaggerated seriousness before pecking it twice. Grace folded her arms. "That is not helpful." Ruby answered with one proud cluck and strutted away as though she had solved the entire problem. Ethan watched the little hen disappear and quietly lowered his nose toward a neat stack of firewood beside the shed. A moment later, he gripped several thick logs between his jaws and carried them all the way to the porch in one easy trip. Grace blinked twice. That was supposed to be 3 trips. Ethan returned for another armful before she could finish speaking. Within minutes, the entire stack had been moved beside the cabin. Grace looked from the neatly piled wood to the large white wolf standing patiently nearby. "You really do enjoy proving me wrong." His ears twitched slightly at the sound of her cheerful voice. Throughout the afternoon, the farm settled into an easy rhythm neither of them had planned. Grace repaired the broken bucket handle with fresh cord, while Ethan wandered quietly through the yard, watching every task with careful attention. When a curious flock of crows landed near the vegetable beds, he rose from beneath the maple tree and trotted toward them. The startled birds scattered into the sky before pecking a single leaf. Grace smiled to herself without interrupting her work. Later, she carried a basket toward the chicken coop to collect the morning eggs. Ruby proudly stood beside the nesting boxes as though supervising the entire operation. Grace laughed. "You always inspect everything, do not you?" Ruby answered with an approving cluck before turning toward Ethan, who had quietly settled beside the coop entrance. The little hen studied him for several thoughtful seconds, then walked directly past him without complaint. Grace raised one eyebrow. "I believe that means you have officially earned her trust." Ethan looked down at Ruby with mild confusion, while the tiny hen continued her important rounds as though nothing remarkable had happened. The peaceful hours slipped by beneath a clear blue sky. Somewhere beyond the distant hills, a church bell rang softly on the afternoon breeze. The sound reached Ethan like a forgotten echo carried across years he could no longer remember. Without warning, he froze. A grand stone hall flashed through his mind. Sunlight poured through towering stained glass windows. Someone knelt before him, calling out words he could almost understand. Then the vision vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. Ethan blinked, breathing a little faster as the empty silence returned. Grace noticed him standing unusually still beside the fence. She walked over slowly, stopping a respectful distance away. "Are you all right?" she asked gently. Ethan could not answer, but after a long moment he looked toward her instead of the forest. The strange feeling gradually faded. Grace smiled with quiet reassurance and set another wooden bowl beside him before returning to gather the last vegetables from the garden. As the sun dipped behind the trees, warm amber light settled across the little farm. Grace rested her hands on the fence and looked toward the great white wolf lying peacefully beneath the maple tree. "I suppose," she said with a soft smile, "you are staying another day." Ethan lowered himself comfortably onto the grass instead of walking toward the forest. For reasons he could not explain, the little farm no longer felt like a place he had stumbled upon. It was beginning to feel like somewhere he wanted to remain. Morning after morning, The little farm settled into a gentle rhythm that no calendar needed to measure. The tomato vines climbed higher along their wooden stakes. Bright yellow flowers opened beside the vegetable beds. Fresh herbs filled the air with the scent of rosemary and mint whenever the breeze wandered through the garden. Even the hens seemed happier, filling their nesting boxes with more eggs than Grace had gathered in weeks. Ethan noticed every change. Although he could not remember his own past, he learned the quiet language of the farm with remarkable patience. Before Grace stepped outside each morning, he had already carried fresh water from the stream to the rain barrel beside the porch. He no longer waited to be asked. When the woodpile grew smaller, more neatly stacked logs somehow appeared beside the cabin before sunset. When the garden gate squeaked in the wind, he nudged it closed until Grace found time to repair the hinge. Every task felt strangely familiar, as though caring for someone had once been part of the life he could no longer remember. Grace gradually stopped wondering how the chores had finished themselves. Instead, she simply smiled whenever she discovered another quiet kindness waiting for her. "You really have been busy today," she said one afternoon, while finding freshly gathered firewood stacked beside the stone fireplace. Ethan lifted his head from beneath the maple tree, watching her with calm silver eyes. She laughed softly. "I suppose that means thank you." His ears twitched ever so slightly, and somehow that tiny movement felt like an answer. Ruby remained determined to supervise every improvement around the farm. Whenever Ethan forgot to latch the chicken coop after cleaning away scattered straw, the outspoken white hen immediately began clucking with theatrical outrage until he returned to fix it. The moment the latch clicked into place, Ruby stopped complaining altogether and marched away with complete satisfaction, as though she had personally trained the large white wolf to become a respectable farmhand. Grace leaned against the fence, laughing until tears almost reached her eyes. "She has promoted you," she announced. "You officially work for her now." Ethan watched Ruby strut proudly across the yard before lowering his head with what looked suspiciously like patient acceptance. By late afternoon, the work was finished, leaving the little farm wrapped in peaceful silence. Grace carried 2 mugs of warm herbal tea onto the front porch, setting one beside herself even though she knew Ethan would never drink from it. Habit had quietly replaced loneliness. She settled into the old rocking chair while the evening breeze carried the scent of fresh hay across the fields. Ethan lay beside the porch steps, resting beneath the fading golden light without closing his eyes. Neither of them spoke. They did not need to. The silence between them no longer felt empty. It had become comfortable, like an old quilt warming both shoulders on a cool evening. Grace looked toward the distant hills glowing beneath the setting sun. "When I was little," she said quietly, "I used to think sunsets lasted forever if someone watched them with you." She smiled to herself before gently shaking her head. "I was wrong about the forever part." Ethan listened without understanding every word, yet the peaceful cadence of her voice settled something deep inside him. A feeling he could not name slowly replaced the constant emptiness that had followed him since waking beside the river. Grace glanced down and hesitated before reaching out with careful fingers. Slowly, giving him every chance to move away, she rested her hand against the thick white fur along the side of his neck. Her touch was light, warm, and filled with simple gratitude rather than fear. "Thank you," she whispered. "This place does not feel nearly as lonely anymore." Ethan remained perfectly still. Instead of pulling away, he allowed his eyes to close for a single peaceful moment, leaning almost imperceptibly into the gentle touch before opening them again. The breeze stirred through the maple leaves overhead, carrying the quiet sounds of home across the little farm. As darkness slowly settled over the valley, Ethan lifted his head toward the first stars appearing above the trees. Somewhere beyond the peaceful fields, far beyond the life he had begun to treasure, a distant dream waited patiently for the night to return. That evening, a gentle rain drifted across the valley, tapping softly against the cabin roof and filling the air with the comforting scent of wet earth and pine. Grace placed another log into the stone fireplace before settling into the old rocking chair with a half-finished knitting project resting in her lap. The warm glow of the fire painted golden shadows across the tiny room, while the steady rhythm of rain wrapped the cabin in peaceful silence. Ethan rested just outside the open doorway beneath the porch roof, where he could watch both the quiet forest and the gentle light spilling from inside. Somewhere along the way, he had developed a habit he never questioned. Whenever Grace was nearby, he felt no need to remain alert. His body relaxed without permission, and for reasons he could not understand, the constant feeling of being lost became quieter. Grace glanced toward the doorway and smiled. "You know," she said softly while guiding the knitting needles through another row, "I used to talk to myself because nobody else was here to listen." She laughed quietly at the memory. "Now I think I spend most of the day talking to you instead." Ethan lifted his head slightly at the familiar sound of her voice. He still could not answer with words, yet he never looked away while she spoke. That alone somehow encouraged her to continue. She told him about the stubborn pumpkin vines that always seemed to grow in the wrong direction, about Ruby's endless determination to supervise every chore, and about the old maple tree that had stood beside the cabin long before she was born. None of the stories were extraordinary, but together they transformed the rainy evening into something warm and deeply peaceful. Ruby suddenly marched through the doorway carrying far more confidence than her small size suggested. She hopped directly onto the folded wool blanket lying beside Ethan and settled there with an unmistakably satisfied cluck. Grace looked over and laughed. That blanket was for him. Ruby closed her eyes as though refusing to negotiate. Ethan lowered his nose toward the determined little hen, then quietly nudged the edge of the blanket until most of it covered Ruby instead of himself. The tiny bird responded with one sleepy chirp before disappearing beneath the soft wool. Grace shook her head with amused disbelief. "You let a chicken steal your blanket." Ethan simply rested his head upon his front paws as though surrendering to the inevitable. The simple moment filled the cabin with gentle laughter before peaceful silence returned once more. Hours slipped by as rain continued whispering against the roof. Grace's knitting gradually slowed until the unfinished scarf slipped into her lap. Her eyelids grew heavier with every passing minute. Without realizing it, she leaned sideways in the rocking chair until her shoulder rested lightly against Ethan's thick white fur near the doorway. She never fully woke. She only sighed softly, comforted by unexpected warmth. Ethan remained perfectly still. Every instinct told him that moving would disturb her peaceful sleep. He did not understand why protecting that quiet moment suddenly felt more important than anything else. Outside, thunder rumbled far beyond the distant mountains. The sound rolled across the valley, and without warning another vision pierced the darkness inside his mind. A silver crown rested upon a velvet cushion. Towering banners fluttered inside a magnificent hall. Countless voices echoed together, strong and proud. "Long live the king." Ethan's eyes opened instantly. His heart raced while the images shattered into countless scattered fragments, leaving behind nothing except an aching emptiness and one impossible question. Who was the king they had been calling? He looked down at Grace, still peacefully asleep beside him, her breathing calm and steady despite the fading storm. Slowly the restless confusion eased. Whatever waited beyond the forest belonged to another life that refused to return. Here there was only the rain, the quiet cabin, the tiny hen snoring beneath the blanket, and the gentle warmth of someone who trusted him enough to fall asleep at his side. Ethan closed his eyes once more, choosing the peaceful present over the distant echoes that still lingered beyond his forgotten past. The farm welcomed another clear morning with the comforting sounds Ethan had quietly come to expect. Ruby announced the sunrise long before the first rays of light reached the porch. The creek murmured beyond the trees, and the breeze carried the familiar sense of fresh bread, damp soil, and blooming herbs across the little valley. Ethan had already returned from the stream with 2 full buckets of water balanced carefully across a sturdy wooden pole resting over his shoulders. He no longer questioned why the work felt natural. His body simply remembered how to serve, even if his mind remembered nothing at all. Grace stepped onto the porch tying the strings of a simple apron behind her back. Wisps of chestnut hair escaped around her face as she smiled at the sight waiting for her. The rain barrel beside the garden was already full. Fresh firewood stood stacked neatly beside the cabin door, and the chickens had been let into the yard before she had even finished waking up. She folded her arms with playful suspicion. "If you keep finishing every chore before I come outside, I'm going to run out of things to do." Ethan paused beside the rain barrel and looked toward her, although words still refused to come. The faint lift at the corner of his mouth had become familiar enough for Grace to understand. "I suppose that was your plan all along," she teased. Ruby marched proudly between them, carrying an egg that looked almost too large for her tiny body. She placed it carefully into Grace's basket, then turned toward Ethan with an expectant stare. Ethan blinked once before walking toward the coop to gather the remaining eggs. The moment he reached for the nearest nesting box, Ruby hurried in front of him and gently pecked the back of his paw. Ethan quietly withdrew his paw. Ruby inspected the nest herself, clucked once with great authority, then stepped aside only after deciding everything was satisfactory. Grace laughed so hard she nearly had to steady herself against the fence. "She promoted you weeks ago," she said between quiet laughs. "Apparently you still need supervision." Ethan glanced from Ruby to the eggs and patiently waited for the tiny inspector to finish every single box before collecting them one by one. By mid-morning, the cabin filled with the warm scent of rising bread. Grace sprinkled flour across the wooden table while preparing dough for the week's baking. Ethan remained nearby, feeding extra logs into the fireplace whenever the flames grew smaller. Without speaking, the two of them had developed a quiet rhythm. She reached for ingredients just as he placed them within easy reach. He opened the oven door moments before she carried over the bread pans. They moved through the little kitchen with an ease that surprised even Grace. "You know," she said while kneading another loaf, "I do not remember what this place felt like before you arrived anymore." She smiled softly without looking up from the dough. "I only know it feels fuller now." Ethan stood quietly beside the window as sunlight spilled across the flour-covered table. Something inside his chest tightened with a feeling that was unfamiliar and strangely comforting at the same time. Grace reached for another handful of flour, but the small cloth bag slipped from her fingers. A soft white cloud burst into the air, dusting the front of her apron, the tip of her nose, and several loose strands of hair. She stared at herself for one surprised heartbeat before laughing. Ethan watched silently. Without thinking, he stepped closer. Grace looked up just as he gently brushed a streak of flour from the end of her nose with the back of one careful finger. The touch lasted only a heartbeat before he quietly withdrew his hand. Neither of them moved. Grace's cheeks warmed with quiet embarrassment, though her smile never faded. "Thank you," she whispered almost shyly. Ruby chose that exact moment to hop onto the table with an indignant cluck, sending both of them into gentle laughter as she immediately began investigating the bowl of dough. Grace lifted Ruby back to the floor, still smiling. "You were supposed to supervise outside." The little hen protested loudly before marching away with exaggerated dignity. Ethan lowered his eyes toward the old wooden bread board resting on the table. Carved into one corner was a faded crest worn smooth by countless years of use. The instant his fingers brushed the symbol, a sharp ache flashed through his head. For one blinding moment, he saw another carved crest gleaming upon the hilt of an elegant sword. Armored figures stood in perfect rows beneath towering banners, while a familiar voice called from somewhere beyond the light. "Your Majesty." The vision vanished as suddenly as it appeared. Ethan caught the edge of the table to steady himself. Grace immediately stepped closer, her smile replaced by quiet concern. "Are you all right?" she asked softly. Ethan slowly lifted his eyes to meet hers and gave the smallest, reassuring nod, but somewhere deep behind those silver eyes, the forgotten past had begun knocking a little louder than before. Grace quietly set the worn bread board aside after Ethan steadied himself against the table. She did not ask another question. Instead, she reached for the kettle resting near the fire and poured warm herbal tea into a small clay mug before placing it gently beside him. "You always look a little pale after those headaches," she said softly. "You do not have to explain anything. Just sit for a while." Ethan lowered himself onto the wooden bench without resistance. The warmth rising from the mug drifted upward with the familiar scent of mint and chamomile. He did not remember ever drinking tea before, yet something about the quiet gesture settled the lingering ache behind his eyes. Grace returned to shaping the last loaf of bread, giving him the kind of silence that expected nothing in return. Outside, Ruby's unmistakable clucking echoed through the open window. Grace smiled without looking up. "I should probably see what she is complaining about this time." She stepped into the yard, only to find Ruby standing beside the herb garden with a single long straw clamped proudly in her beak. The determined little hen marched straight toward Ethan, who had slowly followed Grace onto the porch, and carefully dropped the straw beside his front paws. Ruby stared at him with complete seriousness, clucked once, and waited. Grace laughed so hard that she had to wipe the corner of one eye. I think she believes you are helping me today, so she wants to help too. Ethan looked down at the lonely piece of straw, then gently nudged it closer to the growing basket of kindling, as though accepting Ruby's important contribution. Ruby puffed out her feathers with obvious satisfaction before proudly continuing her inspections around the yard. The peaceful afternoon drifted by beneath a sky painted with slow-moving clouds. Grace spent the next hour hanging fresh herbs beneath the porch roof, while Ethan quietly repaired a loose section of the split-rail fence using smooth branches gathered from the edge of the woods. He worked patiently, studying each knot before tightening it with careful precision. Grace watched him from across the yard, her smile growing softer with every passing day. I honestly do not know how I managed this place without you, she admitted. Everything feels easier now. Ethan paused and lifted his head. He could not answer, yet the quiet warmth spreading through his chest needed no words. Helping her no longer felt like a task. It felt like where he belonged. As evening settled across the valley, a cool breeze carried the scent of pine through the open fields. Grace noticed a small scratch hidden beneath the thick white fur near Ethan's shoulder, where a rough fence post had grazed him during the repairs. Hold still for just a moment, she said gently. She disappeared inside the cabin and returned with a small cloth, clean water, and a jar of homemade herbal salve. Ethan remained exactly where he was. Grace knelt beside him and carefully parted the thick fur just enough to clean the tiny scrape. Her touch was slow, respectful, and unhurried. Ethan never flinched. Instead, he quietly watched her face illuminated by the fading amber light. When she finished applying the salve, she smiled with quiet satisfaction. There, much better. Without thinking, she let her hand rest lightly against the side of his neck for a brief moment. Ethan responded almost instinctively, lowering his head until it rested gently against her open palm. The simple gesture lasted only a heartbeat, yet it carried more trust than either of them fully understood. Grace's eyes softened. "Thank you," she whispered, not because he had allowed her to care for him, but because somewhere along the way he had become part of her everyday happiness. Ruby chose that exact moment to hop onto the porch rail and release one loud, triumphant cluck that made Grace laugh and gently shake her head. "Yes, Ruby, I saw it too." Night slowly settled over the valley. After Grace had fallen asleep inside the cabin, Ethan remained awake beneath the maple tree, watching moonlight shimmer across the quiet fields. Then another dream found him. He stood upon polished stone beneath towering banners bearing the same forgotten crest. Two familiar voices called through the echoing hall, filled with desperate relief. "Your Majesty." "We found him." Ethan turned toward the sound, but before he could see their faces, the vision shattered like glass. He awoke beneath the stars, breathing hard as the words lingered in the silence. Far beyond the sleeping farm, somewhere hidden beyond the distant mountains, someone was still searching for the king he could not remember becoming. The following morning arrived as peacefully as every morning before it. Sunlight spilled across the valley, warming the rows of vegetables that had grown taller with every passing week. Dew shimmered on broad cabbage leaves while wildflowers swayed gently beside the winding path leading toward the creek. Grace balanced a woven basket on one arm as she carefully harvested ripe tomatoes and crisp green beans. Ethan walked quietly beside her carrying another empty basket, his steady pace matching hers without either of them thinking about it anymore. It had become another silent habit, one of countless small routines that now shaped their days together. Ruby marched proudly several feet ahead, stopping every so often to inspect the path before allowing the others to continue. Whenever Ethan reached for a vegetable that Grace had already planned to pick herself, the determined white hen let out one firm cluck as though correcting his timing. Ethan patiently withdrew his paw every single time, waiting until Ruby seemed satisfied before continuing. Grace laughed softly. "You have become the only wolf in the world willing to take orders from a chicken." Ethan lowered his head slightly, accepting Ruby's impossible authority with quiet dignity while the tiny hen continued leading her imaginary parade across the garden. The laughter faded into comfortable silence as they carried the full baskets toward the edge of the field. Above them, clouds drifted lazily across a clear blue sky, and for several peaceful moments the little farm seemed untouched by the rest of the world. Then a distant sound floated across the mountains. Low, hollow, almost swallowed by the wind. Ethan stopped walking immediately. His ears turned toward the northern ridge before the sound reached Grace at all. Another long horn echoed faintly through the valley. It was so far away that Grace barely noticed it. She simply glanced toward the hills before returning to the vegetables. Someone must be traveling through the mountain road, she said without concern. Ethan remained perfectly still. Something deep inside him stirred with quiet urgency. Without understanding why, his eyes swept across the fields, the tree line, the narrow paths leading toward the cabin, and the rocky hills beyond the creek. His breathing remained calm, yet every instinct urged him to study the land as though preparing for visitors he could not remember expecting. The uneasy feeling disappeared almost as quickly as it had arrived, leaving only quiet confusion behind. Grace noticed him staring toward the distant mountains long after the sound had faded. She stepped closer, resting the basket against her hip. "Do you think you know that sound?" she asked gently. Ethan looked toward her before lowering his gaze. He wished he understood the answer himself. Grace did not ask again. Instead, she smiled softly and nudged the basket toward him. "Come on. The carrots will not harvest themselves." Together, they continued working beneath the warm afternoon sun. Later, after washing the vegetables beside the old hand pump, Grace carried 2 baskets toward the porch while Ethan followed with an armful of fresh herbs hanging upside down to dry beneath the roof. As she reached for the cabin door, she noticed him pause once again, staring beyond the fields toward the distant blue mountains that framed the horizon. This time she remained beside him instead of interrupting his thoughts. The breeze lifted loose strands of her hair, while both of them watched white clouds drift slowly above the peaks. "Do you miss somewhere?" she asked quietly. "Or maybe someone?" Ethan did not move. The question settled gently into the silence between them. He searched the empty corners of his memory, but found nothing except scattered fragments that refused to become alive. Grace waited patiently before giving the smallest understanding smile. "It is all right if you do not know." She lowered herself onto the grass beside him, setting the basket aside. Neither of them spoke again. They simply watched the afternoon sky together while Ruby wandered nearby, chasing a particularly stubborn butterfly that refused to cooperate with her important patrol. The tiny hen leaped once, missed completely, then landed in a patch of clover with an indignant cluck that made Grace laugh aloud. Ethan turned toward the familiar sound, and the faintest smile returned to his face. For a little while the distant horn no longer mattered. Peace settled over the valley once again. Yet far beyond the rolling hills, almost hidden by the afternoon haze, several mounted figures slowly emerged along the winding mountain road. The riders remained much too distant for Grace to notice, but Ethan's silver eyes fixed upon them long before they disappeared behind another line of towering pines. That night the little farm settled into its familiar rhythm. Crickets sang from the tall grass while moonlight spread softly across the vegetable garden and the quiet chicken coop. Grace carried a small basket of freshly baked bread to the porch, breaking one warm loaf into smaller pieces before setting a portion beside Ethan as she always did. She smiled when he accepted it with the same calm gratitude he had shown every evening since becoming part of her life. "I keep telling myself not to get used to this," she said quietly while looking toward the stars. "But every day, I do anyway." Ethan rested beside the porch steps, listening to her gentle voice more carefully than the words themselves. Somewhere deep inside him, the sound had become as familiar as the wind through the maple leaves. Grace drew her knees close and watched the darkness beyond the fields. After a long silence, she spoke again, almost as though sharing a secret with the night instead of expecting an answer. "If one day you remember where you belong, I hope the people waiting for you are kind." She smiled, although there was a trace of sadness hidden beneath it. "Whoever they are, I hope they know how lucky they are." Ethan slowly turned toward her. He could not understand why those simple words caused an unfamiliar ache to settle inside his chest. The thought of leaving should have meant nothing to someone with no memories, yet the quiet little farm suddenly felt too precious to imagine losing. Ruby interrupted the silence by hopping onto the porch rail with a dramatic cluck before proudly chasing away an overly curious crow that had landed near the herb baskets. Grace laughed softly. "Thank you, Captain Ruby. The farm is safe once again." The tiny white hen puffed out her feathers with unmistakable pride before marching away to continue her endless patrol. Far beyond the peaceful valley, two riders guided their horses along a narrow forest trail beneath towering pines. The older of the two studied the muddy ground before raising one gloved hand. "Look," Lucas said quietly. Fresh tracks crossed the trail before disappearing toward the river. His younger companion, Mason, dismounted and knelt beside the prince. He brushed away a few fallen leaves, revealing the unmistakable outline of a large wolf's paw. For a long moment, neither guardian spoke. Then Mason exhaled slowly. "White wolf," he whispered. Lucas nodded. "The same size as before." He looked toward the distant mountains where the valley disappeared behind layers of ancient forest. He survived. Relief softened the lines of his weathered face, though concern quickly returned. "If he is alive, we must reach him before anyone else does." Mason stood and adjusted the cloak covering the royal crest stitched carefully beneath the fabric where strangers could not see it. "Do you think he remembers us?" Lucas glanced toward the fading trail. "I only pray he remembers himself." They mounted their horses once more and continued following the tracks toward the river that wound unseen through the forest. Back at the cabin, Ethan remained awake long after Grace had gone inside. A cool breeze drifted across the fields carrying scents from the distant mountains. He lifted his head suddenly. Somewhere beyond the darkness, another faint horn echoed through the night. This time the sound struck him harder than before. A flash of memory burst across his mind. Moonlit armor. Running wolves. Two familiar figures refusing to leave his side, while voices shouted through smoke and wind. One name almost reached his lips before disappearing into silence. Ethan rose to his feet, staring toward the northern ridge with quiet confusion. Behind him, the cabin door opened gently. Grace stepped onto the porch carrying an old wool blanket. She walked to his side without asking why he had not slept and draped the blanket lightly across his shoulders. "You do not have to face every restless night alone," she said softly. Ethan looked at her, then back toward the dark mountains. Slowly, the distant echo faded beneath the simple warmth of the blanket resting against his fur. He lowered himself beside the porch once more while Grace sat quietly next to him beneath the stars. Neither of them noticed that somewhere beyond the northern ridge, two loyal guardians were following a trail that grew clearer with every passing mile. Lucas looked toward the first pale light beginning to touch the eastern sky and spoke with quiet certainty. "We are getting close." The next morning dawned beneath a pale silver mist that drifted quietly above the river, softening every tree and meadow into gentle shadows. Ethan had awakened long before sunrise. Restless sleep had left behind scattered fragments of unfamiliar dreams that refused to disappear. Without disturbing Grace or the chickens, he wandered down the narrow path leading toward the water where everything had begun. The river flowed with the same patient rhythm it had carried on the morning he first opened his eyes without a name. Ethan stood along the pebbled bank, watching sunlight slowly break through the fog until the surface glittered like scattered pieces of glass. Something about the place tugged at him more strongly than ever before. He lowered his head toward the cool water, studying his reflection as though the silent current might finally tell him who he was. The flowing water answered only with another memory. Towering cliffs, a furious roar echoing through the mountains, powerful paws scrambling across loose stone. Then the ground vanished beneath him. He saw himself falling through empty air before crashing into icy water far below. Ethan stepped backward as the vision disappeared. His breathing grew heavier, but this time the memories did not leave him completely. He remembered the cliff. He remembered the river. He remembered surviving. Yet the face of the one who had fallen remained hidden behind an invisible curtain. Back at the cabin, Grace noticed the empty place beneath the maple tree where Ethan usually rested after dawn. She looked toward the open gate and smiled gently to herself. "You are already awake, are not you?" Ruby answered with an impatient cluck before marching toward the path as though volunteering to lead the search. Grace laughed softly, packed fresh bread, sliced apples, and a small flask of cool spring water into a woven basket. then followed the familiar trail toward the river. She found Ethan standing exactly where the current curved around a cluster of smooth rocks. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, and she immediately noticed the distant look in his silver eyes. She did not ask what he had seen. Instead, she lowered herself onto the grass beside him and quietly unpacked the breakfast she had brought. "I thought you might forget to eat," she said with a warm smile. Ethan settled beside her. Together, they shared the peaceful morning without speaking. The river carried leaves downstream, while birds skimmed across the water, searching for insects dancing in the sunlight. Grace tore another small piece of bread and looked out across the gentle current. "Sometimes," she said quietly, "I come here when I cannot make sense of my thoughts. The river never answers me either, but somehow I always leave feeling lighter." Ethan listened carefully. Although he still could not explain the strange memories returning piece by piece, the simple comfort of sitting beside her made the confusion easier to carry. Ruby suddenly burst from the nearby bushes, proudly dragging an impossibly long reed behind her as though she had discovered priceless treasure. She marched directly between Grace and Ethan, dropped the reed at their feet, then looked at both of them with complete satisfaction. Grace laughed until tears gathered in her eyes. "That is very impressive, Ruby." The tiny hen fluffed her feathers proudly before beginning another determined inspection of the riverbank. Far upstream, hidden beyond a bend where dense pines crowded the shoreline, Lucas guided his horse to a careful stop. Mason dismounted beside a patch of damp earth where fresh paw prints pressed deeply into the mud. He traced one print with his fingertips before looking toward the flowing river. "He was here recently," Mason said quietly. Lucas nodded without taking his eyes off the trail. A torn strip of weathered fabric clung to the branch of a low willow tree beside the water. Lucas gently lifted it free. The faded cloth matched the royal hunting cloak Ethan had worn on the day he disappeared. He closed his hand around it for a long moment before slipping it safely inside his coat. "We are following the right path," he whispered. Neither guardian noticed the thin ribbon of gray smoke rising far away beyond another line of trees where Grace's little cabin rested quietly beneath the morning sky. Back beside the river, Ethan lifted his eyes toward the distant cliffs once more. Another sharp flash crossed his mind. Two armored figures shouted his name while reaching toward him across broken stone. He still could not hear the name itself, but this time he knew with absolute certainty that it belonged to him. Grace noticed him tense again. Without interrupting his thoughts, she simply reached into the basket, placed another piece of warm bread beside him, and remained there in peaceful silence. For several precious minutes, the entire world seemed no larger than the quiet river, the gentle breeze, the little white hen chasing dragonflies through the grass, and the kind young woman who had never once asked him to become anyone other than the soul sitting beside her. The afternoon sun drifted slowly across the valley as Grace and Ethan walked back toward the little cabin with the empty breakfast basket resting between them. Ruby marched proudly several steps ahead, occasionally stopping to inspect every pebble on the path as though protecting the entire valley from invisible dangers. Everything looked exactly as it had the day before, yet Ethan could not escape the quiet feeling that something beyond the forest was steadily drawing closer. When they reached the edge of the clearing, Ethan suddenly stopped. His silver eyes lifted toward the northern tree line. Grace followed his gaze but saw only gentle branches swaying in the breeze. "What is it?" she asked softly. Ethan remained motionless. The wind carried a scent that felt strangely familiar. Leather, horses, steel. His heart began to beat faster before he understood why. Far beyond the trees, Lucas and Mason had already dismounted, choosing to continue the final stretch on foot. Neither guardian wished to frighten whoever lived near the quiet cabin. Lucas carefully brushed aside low branches until the little farmhouse finally appeared through the leaves. Thin gray smoke drifted peacefully from the stone chimney, while chickens wandered freely across the yard. Mason exhaled slowly. "Someone lives here." Lucas nodded without taking his eyes from the cabin. "And someone has given him shelter." Neither of them stepped forward. Instead, they waited quietly beneath the trees, allowing the peaceful scene before them to settle into their hearts. Back in the yard, Grace began hanging freshly washed herbs beneath the porch roof, while Ethan quietly carried another bundle of firewood toward the cabin. Ruby wandered directly toward the edge of the clearing before suddenly freezing. She puffed out her feathers, stretched her neck as tall as possible, and released one loud warning cluck toward the forest. Grace looked up immediately. Ruby. The little white hen marched several determined steps toward the trees, refusing to retreat. Ethan slowly placed the firewood beside the porch. Every instinct inside him awakened at once. Without realizing it, he stepped between Grace and the dark tree line. Lucas watched the movement from the shadows and lowered his head. Even without his memories, he whispered, he still protects others before himself. Mason swallowed quietly, emotion filling his eyes. It truly is him. Ethan slowly stepped toward the edge of the clearing, instinctively shielding Grace as the two strangers emerged from the forest. The instant his silver eyes met theirs, something ancient stirred deep within his soul. It was as though the forgotten king and the loyal wolf inside him struggled for a single impossible heartbeat before finally becoming one. Then unbearable pain tore through his body. A deep growl escaped his throat as every muscle tightened beneath his white fur. Grace's heart lurched. Easy, she whispered, taking one uncertain step toward him, but he could no longer hear her. Brilliant silver light burst from beneath his fur, spreading across his body like liquid moonlight flowing over fresh snow. The air itself trembled as an ancient alpha aura swept across the little farm, stirring the grass, rattling the trees, and sending white feathers swirling through the yard. Ruby instinctively tucked her wings tightly against her body, tilting her little head in bewilderment before falling completely silent for the first time since Ethan had arrived at the farm. Ethan threw back his head and released a long, powerful howl that rolled across the valley and echoed through the distant mountains. Then the transformation began. His massive body trembled violently as broad shoulders narrowed, powerful forelegs lengthened, and his hind legs straightened beneath him. Bones shifted with deep, painful cracks while thick silver-white fur dissolved into thousands of shimmering particles that floated upward like tiny stars before fading into the afternoon sky. Grace stared in stunned disbelief. She stumbled back one trembling step, her hand instinctively rising to cover her mouth. It was not fear that rooted her to the ground. It was the impossible truth unfolding before her eyes. The gentle white wolf she had sheltered, cared for, watched over, and quietly welcomed into her lonely little world had never been a beast at all. As the final traces of silver light faded away, a tall man collapsed onto one knee upon the grass, struggling to steady himself as heavy breaths escaped his chest. Damp strands of dark hair clung to his forehead while the last flickers of silver light disappeared around him. Slowly, he lifted his head. The silver eyes that met Grace's were unchanged. They were the same gentle eyes that had carried water from the stream every morning, repaired broken fences without being asked, patiently accepted Ruby's endless inspections, and watched quiet sunsets beside her beneath the old maple tree. Only now they held something they had lost long ago. Lucas and Mason felt every lingering doubt disappear. Without hesitation, both men dropped to one knee, lowering their heads in absolute respect. "Your Majesty," Lucas choked out, his voice breaking with overwhelming relief. Those two words became the final key. Ethan's breathing caught. Images crashed together inside his mind like a storm breaking against ancient stone. Towering castle walls, a silver crown, Frostpine Mountain, the Great Bear, the collapsing cliff, the freezing river, countless faces, countless voices, every forgotten promise, every forgotten duty, every forgotten memory returned in one overwhelming tide. For a long, silent heartbeat, he simply stared at the two kneeling men before him. His eyes searched their faces as though seeing them for the first time and remembering them at the same time. Tears slowly blurred his vision. Then, at last, his lips trembled. "Lucas." The single word carried weeks of loss, relief, and recognition. Mason's eyes glistened as he bowed his head even lower. "We have searched every valley, every forest, and every mountain since the day you disappeared." Grace remained motionless beside the porch. The bundle of herbs slipped quietly from her hands onto the grass. Her heart refused to believe what her eyes had just witnessed. Before her stood a king, yet when she looked into those familiar silver eyes, she did not see a stranger. She saw the same quiet soul who had silently carried water each morning, mended broken fences, shared peaceful evenings beneath the maple tree, and slowly turned a lonely farmhouse into a home. Ethan turned toward her. Their eyes met across the silent yard, and despite the memories of an entire kingdom returning to him, the little cabin, the vegetable garden, the old maple tree, and the kind young woman standing before him suddenly felt just as precious as the throne he had once lost. Ruby finally broke the silence. She marched straight between Lucas and Mason, puffed out her feathers with enormous importance, and released one proud, indignant cluck as though reminding every royal visitor that they had entered her farm first. For one unexpected moment, even the two loyal guardians could not help smiling through their tears. Silence settled gently across the little farm after Lucas and Mason lowered themselves before their king. Even the afternoon breeze seemed unwilling to disturb the quiet moment. Grace remained beside the porch with the bundle of fresh herbs still resting in her hands, uncertain whether the peaceful life she had known only moments before had quietly reached its end. Ethan stood between the two kneeling guardians and the woman who had given him a home without asking his name. Every memory had returned. He remembered the towering castle overlooking endless forests. He remembered the royal council waiting for his judgment. He remembered the hunt that had carried him into the mountains and the desperate battle that had ended with a fall into the river below. He remembered the burden of wearing the silver crown of the Alpha Kingdom. Yet as every forgotten piece returned to its rightful place, another truth stood just as firmly inside his heart. The happiest memories he possessed were no longer found inside the palace halls. They were hidden within a tiny wooden cabin, a vegetable garden, a stubborn white hen, and the gentle smile of the Omega who had never once asked for anything in return. Lucas slowly raised his head, relief still shining in his eyes. "Your Majesty, the kingdom has waited every day for your return. The council never stopped searching. Your people still believe you will come home." Ethan listened quietly before offering the smallest respectful nod. "I know," he answered, his voice calm and steady. It was the first time Grace had heard him speak so clearly. She looked toward him with quiet surprise as the familiar silence that had surrounded him for so many weeks finally disappeared. Mason smiled through grateful tears. "You remember us." Ethan looked toward the younger guardian and allowed himself a gentle smile. "I remember both of you. You never abandoned the search." Neither guardian answered. Their expressions alone revealed how much those simple words meant. Ethan slowly turned away from them and walked across the yard toward Grace. Every step felt strangely light despite the weight of an entire kingdom waiting beyond the mountains. Grace remained where she was, her fingers tightening ever so slightly around the herbs. For the first time since meeting him, she did not know what to say. Ethan stopped only a few feet away. His silver eyes held the same quiet warmth she had known from the day she first offered food to a starving white wolf inside her chicken coop. "Grace," he said softly, speaking her name with complete certainty for the very first time. The sound of her own name spoken in his calm voice brought unexpected tears to her eyes. She smiled through them anyway. "So, you finally remember." Ethan nodded once. "Everything." Grace lowered her eyes for a brief moment before looking back at him with the same gentle expression she had always worn. "Then I am happy for you." There was no bitterness hiding inside her smile, only sincere relief. "Your family must have been worried." Ethan searched her face carefully. They were. A quiet pause settled between them. Grace gathered a slow breath before forcing another brave smile. "Then you should go home." The words were spoken with kindness instead of sorrow. Yet Ethan heard the quiet ache she refused to place upon his shoulders. Before he could answer, Lucas stepped forward and respectfully lowered his head toward Grace. "Miss Grace," he said with deep gratitude, "there are not enough words to thank you. You did not simply save our king. You saved every family in our kingdom that still hoped to see him return." Grace shook her head gently. "I only helped someone who needed help." Lucas smiled warmly. "That is exactly why the debt can never truly be repaid." At that very moment, Ruby marched directly toward Mason with complete confidence, looked up at the tall royal guardian, and pecked the toe of his polished boot as though inspecting an unexpected visitor. Mason blinked in surprise before carefully taking one step backward. Ruby immediately clucked with obvious satisfaction, convinced she had successfully defended the farm once again. Grace laughed softly through the lingering emotion while Lucas struggled unsuccessfully to hide his own smile. Ethan looked toward the tiny white hen and then back toward Grace. For a brief moment, the heavy weight of crowns, kingdoms, and responsibilities seemed wonderfully far away. He reached into the pocket of the weathered cloak Lucas had returned to him and withdrew a small silver pendant shaped like the ancient royal crest. He studied it quietly before closing his fingers around it once more. "I have remembered who I was," he said, never taking his eyes from Grace. "But I also discovered who I became here." He took one final step closer. "Grace, when I return to my kingdom, I do not want to return alone. Will you come with me, not because I am a king, but because you are the reason I remembered what home truly means?" Grace did not answer immediately. She stood quietly beneath the old porch roof where so many peaceful evenings had slipped by without either of them needing many words. Her eyes wandered across the little farm that had been her entire world for so many years. She looked at the weathered cabin that had sheltered lonely winters, at the vegetable garden they had planted side by side, at the split-rail fence Ethan had repaired with patient hands, and finally at the little chicken coop where everything had unexpectedly begun. Ruby emerged from the open doorway with perfect timing, carrying a single feather much too proudly to be considered ordinary. She strutted directly toward Grace, dropped the feather onto her boot, and released one determined cluck before turning toward Ethan as though demanding his opinion on the important delivery. Ethan smiled, the warm, unguarded smile Grace had first seen long before he remembered he was a king. Lucas quietly watched the scene unfold before lowering his head with gentle understanding. "Your Majesty," he said respectfully, "the kingdom has waited many weeks. It can wait one day longer if your heart requires it." Mason nodded at once. Home should never be left without a proper goodbye. Grace looked toward the two guardians with quiet surprise. Neither man showed impatience. Neither spoke of duty before kindness. Ethan stepped closer until only a small distance remained between them. "You once told me that the river never answered your questions," he said softly. "I believe I finally understand why. Some answers are not found in places. They are found in people." Grace's eyes filled with quiet emotion. She looked at him for a long moment before finally smiling through happy tears. "Then my answer is yes." Relief and joy softened Ethan's face. He carefully reached for her hands, giving her every chance to step away if she wished. Instead, Grace closed the small distance herself. Ethan wrapped his arms around her in a warm, gentle embrace that carried gratitude, respect, and every quiet feeling that had grown between them beside the little cabin. She rested her forehead lightly against his shoulder, and for a peaceful moment the entire world seemed wonderfully silent. When they slowly drew apart, Ethan brushed a loose strand of hair away from her face and placed the gentlest kiss upon her forehead before meeting her eyes once more. Nothing more needed to be said. Ruby loudly objected to being ignored. She squeezed herself determinately between Ethan and Grace, forcing them both to step backward while she clucked with unmistakable authority. Mason laughed openly for the first time since arriving at the farm. "I believe we have interrupted the true ruler of this place." Lucas could not hide his smile. "We should probably ask for her permission before leaving." Ruby marched toward the horses waiting beneath the trees and inspected each one carefully before hopping onto a low fence rail with complete satisfaction. Grace wiped away the last of her happy tears while laughing. "She has decided she is coming with us." As though understanding every word, Ruby spread her wings, fluttered onto Mason's saddle, and settled comfortably upon the rolled travel blanket. Mason stared at the tiny white hen in complete disbelief. "I do not think she plans to move." Lucas folded his arms, fighting another smile. "Then I suggest you accept your new commander." Even Ethan laughed, a rich, genuine laugh that echoed across the valley and filled the little farm with more joy than it had known in many years. Before leaving, Grace stepped inside the cabin one final time. She gathered only a small woven basket, the knitted scarf she had never quite finished, and the simple wooden bowl she had first used to feed a starving white wolf on the night their story began. She looked around the quiet room without sadness. This place had never truly been about walls or furniture. It had been about love freely given. When she stepped outside again, Ethan gently accepted the basket from her hands before offering his arm. Together they walked toward the waiting horses while Lucas closed the little garden gate behind them. Nothing was abandoned. Nothing was forgotten. The cabin would remain exactly where it had always stood, waiting for every future visit home. As the small group followed the winding road beneath the golden light of sunset, Ethan glanced once more toward the little farm before turning to Grace with peaceful certainty. "The day I lost my memories," he said softly, "I believed I had lost everything. Instead, I found the greatest gift my life could ever hold. I found my home." Grace smiled and slipped her hand into his. Ahead of them waited a kingdom longing for its king. Behind them rested a little farm that would forever be part of his heart. Between those two worlds rode a gentle Omega, two faithful guardians, one extraordinarily important white hen, and a king who had finally discovered that true strength was measured not by the weight of a crown, but by the kindness that gave it meaning.